Today on the podcast, I have my client, Margot Stornelli. Margot, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, you worked for years as a librarian. So, obviously, books have always been a huge part of your life. When did you realize they were going to be such a huge part of both your career, for years and your career now as an author?
After I retired, I just realized, my kids don't really know my life story. And I knew very little about my parents' life story. And I just decided I'm going to write it. I started writing a diary and I had so much information. I decided maybe I should learn how to write a book.
Well, tell me about that diary process. Was there a moment, like, do you remember buying a notebook and being like, this is a thing that's going to happen?
Although this day and age, I did it all online, Microsoft Word and several files. And then I just started putting all those files together and then I had to try to connect them.
Well, the memoir, The Big Red Suitcase, is a travel memoir ultimately. At what point did you start to think of it as that, as opposed to just being, here's my life that I'm sharing with my kids, and becoming more of a, here's a book about travel and my life experiences abroad?
And I think it was 2023. I had already been retired 2 years and my daughter just had her first baby and I was doing a lot of babysitting. And I just decided I wanted to pass my legacy down to her. And I started Googling, memoirs and writing and stuff like that. And I hooked up with a lady who's in Alaska and started watching her like webinars every week. Thursday nights at 7:30. I tuned in with 150 other people. And she also did a lot of the featuring someone's writing every week and stuff like that. But I wasn't in the writing stage just yet. And after a year of listening to her every week, I decided, maybe I ought to get started. I'm not getting any younger.
Was there ever a memoir that you read or that you recall and you started kind of thinking, I might do one of these one day?
Believe it or not, Anne Frank.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, obviously
Yeah,
huge, huge book for so many people.
because my mother is also Jewish, although I was not raised in the Jewish faith. And I learned a lot about the Holocaust and, just the war in Europe when I was in Europe 50 years ago, because I had missed my senior year of high school where they teach all that stuff. So I just really started getting interested in reading all kinds of memoirs of survivors of the war. And then I just decided, maybe I can do this too.
Well, I think that's something you touch on in the book is this idea of learning about history and cultures by going there. And I think you actually discuss speaking with Holocaust survivors in your
Um,
education and kind of how different that was than maybe learning about it from a distance back home.
Also, in 2025, it was the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. And the Dutch and Canadians have quite a connection because the Dutch royal family lived in Ottawa during the war. They exiled there. And there's always been a relationship since then of sending tulips and stuff like that back and forth. And so I went to an exhibition in Mississauga, which is outside of Toronto, with a friend of mine who is also Dutch Canadian. Her father married a war bride. And it was a very nice exhibit. There was 80 participants. Their pictures were plastered along the wall with little captions underneath, stories that they told about where they were 80 years ago. And most of them, of course, were young children being displaced by their families, their homes. I also, I think, ended the book with that exhibit. And it was just a very interesting experience to just go there and see this and see all these stories that these people wrote, who were, displaced by the war and everything.
Well, you were born American, you grew up in America. Then you had this time abroad, which the book really focuses on, and you ultimately ended up settling in Canada. So tell us about this whole idea of cultural identity and how the book explores your journey from America to Europe to ultimately ending up in Canada.
I ended up moving to Canada 5 years later after I came home from Europe. I quit college at that time and met a guy and ended up marrying him and here in Toronto. And I guess just from having lived in Europe for so long and not really settling back into the groove of American life once I returned home, I just sort of things were twirling in my head that maybe I could live abroad. And, just going up to Toronto a couple of times with a girlfriend for long weekends, I was seeing how, even though we're next door, I was less than 200 miles away from home. It was a totally different experience as a tourist and then later as a resident, than living in America. And it was something that I just adapted to and I just really enjoyed. And 45 years later, I'm still here.
So, given this is a book about travel and movement, where do you consider home now?
Well, I think ultimately Rochester will always be my home where
Yeah.
I grew up, even though I left when I was 23 years old. My parents stayed in my childhood home until the early 90s, for 35 years or so. And my kids also were introduced to that home when they were born. Rochester will always be my home. I still stay in touch with a lot of high school friends. They have reunions every 5 years. And also, of course, webpage now where we can update our profiles and stuff like that. I lived in Canada 37 years before I decided to become a citizen. People were always asking me, why haven't you changed your citizenship? And I kept making up excuses. Oh, maybe one day I'll have to move back to the US for one reason or another, or I'll want to be a snowbird in Florida or something. I hate to admit it, but the first election of Donald Trump in 2016 was the night that I downloaded the application. And I was sworn in 6 months later.
Speaking of America, the early portion of the book does revisit your childhood there.
Uh-huh.
I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. So tell me about the process of digging back into your childhood and how did you go about bringing to life these memories and moments from so long ago?
My mother was moved into assisted living 2 years ago. And when my sister and I cleared out her apartment, I ended up with all the photographs. And one day I just started looking through it, pictures I'd never seen before. And then I started piecing things together, comparing, because my photo album collection really didn't start until the 1980s when I was already here in Canada and having my own children. So I just started putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. Both my parents are in their late 90s now. And whenever I went for a visit, I tried to visit, every 6 weeks or so for a weekend. My father started talking a lot about when he was growing up. Like he never fought in the war, but he did work as a clerk on one of the forts in Georgia, I think. And he just started talking about his childhood. I started asking my mother the same questions, but she didn't want to talk about it. So, my older sister knew a lot about my mother's childhood that I didn't know. So, we just started sharing stories and I just started making mental notes of everything and to sort of piece of the story together. When my father first started practicing about a year before I was born, he's a doctor, family physician. We had a house attached to an office on a very busy intersection. I don't really remember at that time because, of course, it was before, my first 4 or 5 years of my life. But when we got older and the family started visiting Rochester, my father still had the office with the house, so that's where we would stay, when there were two or three families visiting and the other house was full. Me and my kids would pick the office to stay there, and my kids started running around, with these. It was the upstairs had these really old walk-in closets that connected together. And so I just sort of pieced the story together there, that my childhood must have been around the same thing.
Well,
And
you speak early in the book about the importance that family vacations played, and that
yeah,
your ultimate experiences in Europe were really set up by your family's frequent travels in your youth. Tell us a little bit about that. What was it like?
it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of road trips. I can remember we got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. My dad would drive, 7, 8 hours, like to one of our frequent annual road trips was to the White Mountains in New Hampshire, where we stayed at a lodge at the base of the mountain. We had a backpack with 3 days worth of clothes in it, and we climbed this mountain. We stayed at cabins up on the top of the mountain. Well, it was more like a lodge with two large bunk rooms, one for men, one for women, and a huge dining living area, where they would serve hot meals and breakfast in the morning, and they had a bagged lunch packed for everybody for the next day. I sincerely doubt there were any accommodations for food allergies or anything like that back then. And it was a lot of fun. It was like an annual tradition right up until the time I went to college.
And those weeks every summer, do you think it instilled in you a sense of curiosity or bravery, perhaps? What attributes do you think you learned
Definitely
from them?
bravery. Our very first trip up the mountain when I was 5 or 6 years old, and there was 4 kids at the time between the ages of 5 and 10, plus my parents. As we were climbing up the mountain to our first hut, we got stuck in a snowstorm or hailstorm, in the top of the mountain. And we had already been hiking all day. And we saw a bunch of other people just sitting around on rocks and logs and stuff. And we joined them. And everybody was getting worried, I guess, about, being lost. And so, yeah, some of the older gentlemen that were there, they started a fire. And then all of a sudden, one of them noticed, oh, there's a searchlight out in the distance. So obviously, the staff at the cabin were getting worried because, 15 people were missing from their reservation. And yeah, I guess they made contact back in the day. I mean, there were no radios or cell phones, and they found us and brought us back to the cabin. As it turned out, we were maybe only a half a mile away, but of course, we didn't know that at the time. And in that kind of, weather conditions.
Well, you bring up the idea of like back then what was available, and that was something that really jumped out at me in the book was just how disconnected people were before cell phones, before
Yeah.
the prevalence of the internet. I think I mentioned to you there's a period of time in the book where you're out of contact with your parents for over a month. And I just think about I if I go a day without contact with my kids, I wonder what's going on. And it's really an interesting glimpse into a time where children had or teens had to be much more independent than
Yes.
today, much more so.
Mhm.
Here you are. How old are you in the book? In the core section of the book, 18?
My trip to Europe was, yes, age 17 to 18.
17 to 18, and you're alone in Europe navigating these other countries, these other cultures. I,
Without a cell phone,
without a cell phone, without a
without a
computer, without
computer or
internet.
internet or email.
And yet it was a profoundly transformative experience for you, so much so that you're still writing about it all this time later. Why do you think that was?
Before I left, like we had an exchange student a year or two earlier. And I think it was just for like one semester, like 4 or 5 months. And I really got to like her. And of course, as soon as we really got to know each other, it was time for her to leave. My sister had been to France one of the summers before that. My brother had also been to Israel working on a kibbutz. And I was just thinking in the back of my mind, a summer is too short, would feel like a vacation. If I'm going to do this, I want to get to know people, get to feel the experience. And also, I don't know, it was just a time in my life, like most typical teenagers. I just wanted to get out on my own as quickly as possible.
I hear you there for sure.
And so, yeah, I looked into the year-long program. I found out I was very concerned. Can I do this my senior year of high school instead of waiting till after I graduated? Because I just didn't want to fall behind. I wanted to stay with my age group when I was in college and stuff. So I found out, and the guy told me, yeah, you can double up on your credits. You won't have any study halls, and you could probably graduate as a junior instead of a senior. So that's what I did. Little did I know, of course, at the time that my departure day was going to be my graduation day. Kind of regret missing out on that. But fortunately, with the way our school district, has these reunions all the time, and they are arranged, organized by class volunteers every year. As a matter of fact, a couple of times, I got involved from here in Canada just by doing the looking people up online and trying to find them. It's been kind of nice that every 5 years, at least 100 of us get together. It was a graduating class of, I think, 450 or 500 people. Of course, several have passed away, but there's a core group that always goes to these reunions that not only live in Rochester, but have also come back to Rochester for these events.
The book is called The Big Red Suitcase. What role do you see that suitcase playing in the story?
Well, actually, the title of the book went through a couple of name changes. When I landed on the suitcase title, people in your class, as well as friends and family who knew I was writing, were very excited about it.
Do you see it as a symbol of freedom, or does it represent something else to you?
Yeah, it's like my little companion. I don't have a dog, but I do have a suitcase on wheels that I can stroll through an airport.
Well, one of my favorite part about your book and parts about travel memoirs in general is always hearing about the food that people eat elsewhere in other cultures. And your book covers some really interesting meals and things that you have, both good and bad. So, are there some particular either favorite or not so favorite meals from the experiences covered in the book that come to mind?
I do not like pea soup, and that is a staple in the Netherlands. More so with the last family I stayed with for a couple of months, not with the other ones. I sipped at it and endured it as often and as much as I could. There are other foods in the Netherlands that I've been introduced to that I still have today. One's called a stroopwafel, and what it is, it's a small, like, waffle, and it has syrup or honey in the middle of it. And it's a very flat waffle. It's delicious. It's pretty much a breakfast staple, or eaten with coffee and tea. Like they do have a tradition of a coffee break in the morning, a tea break in the afternoon, just like the British, and then another coffee or tea break in the evening after dinner. Always served with little treats.
Do you have a favorite moment that from the book, or maybe a favorite chapter that comes to mind?
I would say the chapter I wrote about the year in Europe, just because it's just been a significant memory that I've cherished all my life. I've adopted a lot of the customs that I learned over there. I still correspond with three girlfriends, one of them being the Dutch sister who was in California the year that I was at her home. But we met in person 3 or 4 years later, and we've been in touch ever since. She and her parents developed their own relationship with my mother. My mother and brother and sister came to visit the Netherlands that Christmas that I was there. We had 2 weeks together, and we took a side trip to Paris while they were there. Yeah, it just that was the first chapter I wrote actually with the book.
Hmm.
Just going through all my bags of pictures that I had. I and I never did find the diary, but I got in touch with the three girlfriends and they sent me stuff. For instance, one of the girls, they had a summer home on one of the islands north of the Netherlands, and I had been there twice. And I had also written a thank you note in their guest book. And this is from 1974. And my friend found it and scanned it and sent it to me.
Amazing. Amazing. And so you were able to incorporate it into the book.
Yeah. And, we just, the three of us have kept in touch for 50 years now. They've all been to Toronto and the US a couple of times where we reconnected. And it was 30, I went back to the Netherlands the Christmas of 77, about 3 years after my year there. And then it was another 37 years or so before I went back again, just because once I got married, we just didn't travel that much, or, there were other priorities. So it was really nice to make that trip 12 years ago in 2013 and bring my daughter with me. My daughter was very impressed. She liked the fact that everybody spoke English.
It does make travel easier.
Yeah. Even the younger people spoke very good English. So that was very impressive.
Well, speaking of your daughter and your son and your own parents who are both still alive, you mentioned being inspired to start this whole journey by wanting to share your story. The book is now out. Has anyone had a chance to read it yet? And if so, have you gotten any feedback?
It only just went on the market about a week or two ago.
Brand new.
My oldest brother did say he ordered it, but at the same time, I was compiling a list of 25 family members and friends for the publisher to send it to. So he's going to get 2 copies. Hopefully, one of them will come back to me. As soon as I advertised it on my high school website, one of the girls jumped in and said, "Oh yeah, I'm ordering it now."
Well, where is the book available? If we want to send folks to go pick up their copies, where should we send them to buy it?
They can search the Big Red Suitcase. It'll take them to Barnes and Noble and Amazon, as well as to the publisher's website, to their bookstore.
Oh,
And it's available in Amazon.com and .ca.
last thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap things up is you were one of the attendees at my retreat last
Yes.
summer. And, it was so wonderful to get to spend that time with you in person and get to see you just working so hard on the book. Can you tell us a little bit about the retreat experience and the role it played just in helping you finish up the process that was, writing and revising the book?
I was very, very impressed with the location and the setting. It was like an old-fashioned manor home in the middle of the woods, just north of Ottawa on the Quebec border. It was just really nice 4 days of with a small group of people. You did a lot of teaching during that time. We had a lot of free time to either, walk through the woods or do our own writing. The hostess, Sandy, was very accommodating. She made delicious meals, had always, healthy snacks out and everything. I was very impressed by the whole situation. I'm glad I did it. It was, yeah, I, well, I never really finished writing the book until around Christmas time, but I got a lot done during that week that you just don't get when you're at home and you're distracted by everything in your home. And that was like my quote unquote vacation for 2025. And I'm glad I did it. It was a very interesting experience for me.
Well,
And I highly recommend an experience like that to anyone I run into, whether it's for writing, cooking, art, anything like that.
well, it was absolutely wonderful having you there, and it's been so fun working with you and supporting you on this book for the last year or so.
And can I say one more thing?
Absolutely, hit us.
That 6 hour blackout was quite an experience.
Oh yes, okay. Absolutely. So, I mean, this is one of the funny things about life. I think so many people, whether they're putting together a retreat or writing a book, they're so focused on what could potentially go wrong, and it terrifies them, and they think that in order for it to be good, everything has to go perfect. Whereas, as you point out, in the middle of the retreat, we had a giant storm and we lost all power. Was it just after dinner or even during dinner almost?
And I think it started around 4 or 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
And it was around 10 o'clock before the power came back on.
I don't think it came back until like 3 in the morning.
Or
It was,
maybe, yeah, maybe later.
and so, major problem. And yet, for me, that was one of the funnest parts of the retreat. We
Yeah.
got out the candles and we hung around the table and we spent the evening talking. And
Mhm.
maybe it wasn't the most productive night in terms of getting writing done since we had no
No.
electricity, but it was my favorite night, I think, of any of the retreats I'd done. Just getting to spend time. What I always wanted from my life was to create a life where I could spend time with artists, where I could
Mhm.
hang out with people who cared about books and literature and cinema, and talk about the things that were of interest to me. And that night, it was kind of like what I always wanted, sitting around a table with some wine and beer and candles and talking about books all into the late into the hours. So
Mhm.
yeah, it was that was a it's just a great example of, sometimes the best things are the things you don't plan for and you can't plan
Right.
for and that aren't perfect, but are real and special in their own way. Well, Margot, congratulations on
Thank
the
you.
publication of the Big Red Suitcase. We'll have links in the show notes for this episode where people could go and pick up the book. What do you have on the radar coming up in the next weeks or months ahead in terms of getting the word out there about the book?
My book will be featured at the London, England Book Fair in middle of March. And there's another book fair scheduled in Los Angeles at middle of April. And I will be attending that book fair to sign books with 4 other authors from this publisher. I'm really looking forward to that because I've always been on the other side of the table, getting my book signed instead of doing the signing. So that'll be a new experience for me. I'm really looking forward to it. And of course, getting back into social media to try to set up some marketing, promotions for the book.
Well, there's nothing better than, starting to work with someone where they have an idea or a draft of a manuscript and getting to follow that journey to the point where I get to interview you and you get to say, I'm headed on a plane to LA to do a book signing in a couple weeks. It's so exciting for me. And it's such a pleasure to be a small part of that journey with you. So, Margot, thank you for
Yeah,
allowing me to
and
work with you on this project.
yeah, I just want to plug that uh, I've really enjoyed working with you this past year. I don't think I would have abandoned this project had I not had your weekly guidance of 2 or 3 times a week, and sharing our scenes and getting them critiqued not only by you but by other classmates. I don't think I would have done it otherwise if I hadn't had that one-on-one and a small group experience of 20 people, just to share our stories with. And the other thing being, I was the only one doing a memoir. Everyone else is writing fiction. So it was a very interesting experience getting involved in that.
Well, it was an honor to get to work with you. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining me on the Writing Coach podcast today.
Thank you.